Hi, today's video is on the Zyxel VMG8825-B50B router and the web interface and all of the pages which are on it. This video might be a fairly long video, also I may go fairly quickly through some of the pages. So do remember that YouTube has a pause button and you can use that if you want to skip through or spend longer on a page looking at what is on there. The idea of this video is to make it easier for those people who have to remotely support somebody who is using one of these routers in telling somebody how to do something. So if you don't have remote access to a computer or you need to talk somebody through logging in to change a username or password or change the Wi-Fi details or something, this video is designed for that. So the default IP address of the router is 192.168.1.1. The default username is admin and the password is normally on a sticker on the back of the router. The front page gives you general system status and connectivity information. So if you click on the yellow arrow to the bottom right of the connectivity box, you get a list of the devices that are connected to the router. If you go back to the home page and then click on the yellow arrow next to system information, you get quite a lot of detail about what is connected and what speed they are connected at. What's also quite good is the wireless shows you at what speed the wireless interface is broadcasting or running at as well. Scrolling down and clicking on the little yellow arrow on the Wi-Fi settings box takes you to the wireless settings, but this is a smaller Wi-Fi screen than if you access it through the menu in the top right. Doing the yellow arrow on the guest Wi-Fi settings gives you, as you would expect, the guest Wi-Fi details, and again this one gives you fewer configuration options than going through the menu in the top right. Doing the LAN settings box gives you again more cut down configuration for your local area network. The parental control option doesn't seem to do anything because by default some of the options you need are switched off. So I'm going to go and turn that feature on that you need to be able to then turn on the parental controls, and we'll see what parental controls looks like. So mesh needs to be off, then need to go back to the home page, scroll down and click on parental controls, which didn't work, which means you also need to turn off something called One Connect. So with One Connect turned off, we can go back to the home page, scroll to the bottom and click on parental controls, and we now get the settings available within there. You can then add a device to apply a schedule to and which days to apply that schedule. I'm going to set the settings back to how they were so we can go back through the rest of the menus. So going into the more in-depth settings, connection status is the home page that you've been on. Network settings gives you broadband, which is your WAN settings. For the UK, if you're using ADSL, you need to set it to PPPoA. Fill in your ISP's username and password, or otherwise known as the PPP details. Needs to be on VPI 0 and VCI 38 with VC MUX encapsulation. If you're using VDSL, so that's fiber to the cabinet, or otherwise known as BT's Infinity service, again it needs to be PPPoE. If you're on another provider such as TalkTalk or Sky, these settings will not work. Fill in the PPP details again. Make sure you turn on VLAN. The top option needs to be 0 and the bottom option, so the Q option, needs to be 101. This router supports cellular backup as well. I didn't have a USB modem that I could plug in, so I was unable to test these settings, but hopefully just scrolling down and seeing what you see on the screen is helpful to somebody. It also gives you the ability to restrict data, or at least alert when you're getting close to your data limits. And under the Broadband Advanced menu, you get a plethora of options about what kinds of modulations and features to support on the ADSL and VDSL port. Going into the wireless menu, this is the more in-depth one, so if you click on the wireless on the home screen, you don't get anywhere near this amount of information. So if you go through the menu in the top right, you get all these extra options. There seems to be a limit of 32 devices to be able to connect to this router per radio, so you can have 32 devices on the 2.4 GHz and also 32 devices on the 5 GHz Wi-Fi. So essentially 64 wireless devices connected to this single router. If you want to change the 5 GHz Wi-Fi settings, you need to select band and then 5 GHz, and again the settings that you change on this page will affect the 5 GHz radio rather than the 2.4. Under the guest or more APs, you can set up to 3 Wi-Fi names for guests to join, with all sorts of different topologies. This one looks like they only get access to the internet and nothing else. They can't contact other devices on the network or the LAN or the Wi-Fi. And home guest looks like they'll be able to access some stuff on the guest maybe, and also the internet. Under the MAC Authentication tab, you can restrict or allow access to devices on the wireless by their MAC address. Always be aware that it's very easy to change MAC address on a wireless device, so don't use that option and view it as highly secure, because it will be very easy for anyone to get around if they're technically competent. Under the WPS option, WPS is used to connect printers and other things that don't have anywhere to type in a password. You can start the push button config, and then on the printer you press the same wireless button, and it will connect without you having to type in a wireless password. WMM is to do with quality of service. I don't think I've ever really seen it used in a network, so I'm afraid I can't explain much about that. The other section seems to be more to do with advanced wireless configuration and how often it sends beacons and transmits its wireless name, etc. And channel status, supposed to show you what channel is best to use. In my environment, there are a huge number of wireless networks around, except the Zyxel only picked up on some on channel 1 and channel 11. There are definitely more wireless access points than that, so I wouldn't say that the wireless channel scanning is particularly accurate. Mesh is to do with Zyxel's own mesh system, so that would only be useful if you've got any other Zyxel things that support their mesh. In the schedule, you can also turn wireless on and off at certain times of day. Moving on to the next menu setting under Network Settings and then Home Network. This is where you can change the IP address range that the router is on and turn off DHCP and change the DHCP range and length of time that it hands out IP addresses. Static DHCP is where if you wanted a computer to always get the same IP address, even if it had been out of the building for a long time, you can add it there, and then the next time it's back in the building, even if it's beyond the DHCP lease time, it will still get the same IP address. Under UPnP, you can set and see the status of the dynamic port forwards that Universal Plug and Play can do. Additional subnets, I'm not entirely sure how it works, but it looks like you can add another IP address to the LAN interface. Wake on LAN allows you to send a magic packet to a device, and if that device has Wake on LAN enabled, it should switch that machine on automatically. TFTP server name is to do with provisioning configuration from your internet provider, or I guess possibly within your LAN. Moving on to the next one, which will be the routing menu. You can set up static routes. So if you had multiple WAN interfaces set up on this router and you wanted it to go down certain connections, you can also make sure that the DNS resolver built into the router will send a query for a specific domain name out of a specific WAN interface. Policy route should redirect specific traffic to a machine or a port to a specific gateway. And then you've got RIP, which is Routing Information Protocol. And moving on to the next one with QoS, the quality of service. The connections that I was using this router on are far too quick to benefit from any QoS settings, so I'm afraid I can't tell you exactly how this QoS screen works. Moving on to the next menu, which is the NAT menu, is where you do port forwarding. So you can call your service what you want to call it, which one or which the connection's coming in on, which port you want it to listen on, whether you want it to translate to a different port in your network, and then the machine that you want to get that traffic. Port triggering I've never used in a router, but it looks like you can have it so that if somebody, say, connects port 5060 for SIP, it then opens up other ports for real-time protocol, so audio data. You've got DMZ menu, which forwards every single port to a specific computer on your network. That's not really worth using unless you've got a specific use case for it, because you really should just find out what ports you need to forward rather than using DMZ. DMZ is the lazy option, basically. Moving on to the ALG menu, these are called application layer or layer gateways or level gateways. Generally, the SIP one for VoIP messes stuff up. So if you have a SIP phone system or a SIP phone that is doing very strange things, it's worth going into the NAT ALG section and turning off the SIP ALG. You may also find that if you use a PPTP VPN or an IPSEC VPN, you may wish to turn that off as well. Finally, the NAT Sessions screen allows you to set how many connections a single computer is allowed to make looking at my network, where I've got a computer that's doing a lot of connections. It's not doing peer-to-peer torrenting, but it's doing a lot of connections, a lot of programs open. I was only using about 200 or 300 connections through my router. But if you're finding that connections are dropping, you may wish to change the maximum NAT sessions per host. Moving on to the next option, which is the DNS option, you can add specific DNS entries. So a good use case for this one is I have some telephones which are second-hand, and when you factory reset them and plug them straight into the internet, they go off to a hostname called SNMP, which is the make of the phone, .provu.co.uk, which is a supplier, and they try and download the configuration. So if I've set up my own custom configuration, the next time I plug them in, they go off to the internet and then download the factory or factory set configuration, which is somebody else's phone system. So I have to make sure that on my network I block snom.provu.co.uk so that the phones can't reach out to the external configuration server and wipe away my configuration. So that's quite a good function to have built into the router. Then you've got dynamic DNS, which has quite a good set of support for providers. Some routers don't support a lot of useful providers or only support paid providers. So DynDNS is a paid provider, but the nice one to see there is No-IP, which provide, or at least still at the moment, at the time of recording this video, they provide free dynamic DNS host names. Moving on to the next menu, the IGMP MLD menu. No idea what any of these settings do, but hopefully this screen is useful to you. Moving on to the VLAN groups. Again, the setup that I was using this in doesn't use VLANs, but the screen looks fairly obvious for what, if you needed to use VLANs, what you can set. Group interface grouping, which I guess is the kind of poor man's VLAN. Then you've got USB services for if you plugged in a hard disk into the back of the router. Moving on to security, then firewall. There's not much I can say about these screens. Expect if you've got a bridged network or some other kind of network set up, rather than a NAT network, this screen would be useful, but in NAT it should be blocking anything except for the stuff you've port forwarded. In security, again, you can do MAC filters. This should apply to the wired connections as well as the wireless, and once again, it's easy to spoof a MAC address, so be aware that that's not a particularly secure method of securing your network. Then the certificate screen is probably used for loading up trusted root certificates or local certificates to identify the router for internet providers that use TR69 or ACS auto configuration services to deploy settings to routers. In the VoIP menu, this is where you can set up accounts to go through to the 2 VoIP ports on the back of the router, where you can plug in an analog telephone. Under VoIP and then phone is where you associate the accounts with the 2 ports on the back of the router. And also where you set the region, which probably sets the kind of ringtones and noises that you hear when the phone line is engaged or has some other problems. Call rules looks like speed dials, and call history should have a history of any inbound and outbound calls. Moving on to System Monitor, the next menu option. You've got the logs for the router, traffic status, which should show you the speed going through the router, going out onto the internet, and some statistics about the local ports on the router, so all the LAN ports and the Wi-Fi ports. And going back to the NAT sessions, and if it was running out, you can use this traffic status NAT screen to see how many sessions a device has open, so you can see whether you do need to up your number of concurrent NAT sessions. Moving on to VoIP status, although this won't show any information because I don't have any accounts set up, but on this screen is where you'd see the status of whether the accounts were registered and usable. ARP table will show you all the devices that the router has discovered on the network. Routing table should give you the list of routes and any static routes that you've added. Multicast status, I'm not sure. This wasn't plugged into a big network, so there wasn't anything to see in that screen. xDSL status gives you a huge amount of information to do with the DSL port or the VDSL port. WLAN connection status would show you the speed of the wireless devices connected. So if you're having trouble with, say, buffering on a TV or some other device which might be far away from the router or just potentially a bad device, you can go into this screen and see whether the TV shows as being connected at only 11 megabits or some low rate, and see whether other devices in your network are connected at high rate, so you can identify basically is it wireless overall that's being bad or that specific device. And then moving on to cellular statistics. Again, I didn't have a dongle to plug in or a USB modem to plug in, so I couldn't show you any stats on that screen, I'm afraid. And finally, the maintenance menu. Under System, you can set the hostname and the local domain name of the router. User accounts, you can add other people so they can log in and change some settings. Or, in this instance, the user one allows you to set somebody up to access the files that are stored on the USB storage if you've plugged it into the back of the router. Remote management is where you would enable if you wanted WAN Ping, which is quite helpful for setting up reliability graphs and other things, and also if you wanted to allow yourself or anyone else access on the web interface, on the WAN side, on the internet side, to the HTTP interface of the router to change settings, or SSH to be able to SSH in and make changes. SNMP will be useful to turn on if you've got network monitoring within your environment and want to do log stuff like the throughput and devices connected and everything. Under time, you can set time servers and also the time zone, so your logs which are stored on the router have the correct information, have the correct time recorded against them. Email notification is where you would set up mail servers if you wanted it to email you when your 3G data was coming to a limit. I also expect you can get this router to email you some of the logs as well. And there we go, on the log screen indeed there is an email log setting, so that's where you would switch that on if you did want it to email you a summary of the logs. Firmware upgrade screen is where you would upload new firmware if you get it from Zyxel. Backup and restore to back up the configuration. When you do back up the configuration, it is a big I think it's an XML file. If it isn't an XML file, it's certainly human readable, which is nice to see. Then you've got the option to reboot and a diagnostic screen for doing pings, trace routes, and the OAM ping screen is for testing down the DSL line. So if you needed to see whether you were getting a response from the exchange equipment, you can use the OAM ping option. And there we go, that's everything. I hope the video has been helpful to you. It would be really helpful to me if you wouldn't mind subscribing to my YouTube channel. You don't need to have the notifications for new videos switched on, but the subscriber numbers really do help.